This learning module is on annotated bibliographies. Let's start with what exactly an annotated bibliography is. Annotated bibliographies are usually used in larger research projects. Larger, by larger I mean usually larger than what an undergraduate student produces on a regular semester by semester basis. Most papers that you produce as an undergraduate tend to be about 10 pages long, 5 to 10 pages long. An annotated bibliography often helps students gather important and detailed information about a variety of texts, such as books, journal articles, and, of course, internet materials. When you're writing an annotated bibliography, you should usually read the text first, or maybe not read, but at least skim over, and then write summaries or analyses. It's, in essence, you're taking notes for yourself, depending on the assignment and the purpose for writing the annotated bibliography. Annotated bibliographies are usually written for one of the following reasons. First of all, to summarize a lot of text for a research project. That's probably the one that you're familiar with. In other words, your professor gives you an assignment. I want you to write a research paper. I want you to go to the library and use various resources. I want the paper to be 20 pages long. And so you go to the library, and either in person or virtually, and you look through a number of texts on whatever subject it is that you have chosen. You might also create an annotated bibliography to help you write a doctoral thesis, which is in essence a very, very large research project. You might write one as part of a larger research assignment that a professor specifically has given to you. Or you might be compiling it to be published independently as a resource. Okay, if you're an undergraduate, probably not. But you know, once you hit graduate school and or if you become an instructor, a professor, this is the kind of work that is relatively common. In the digital age, it's becoming a little less common because we have access to these full-text databases like JSTOR and Project Muse that we've already talked about. But in the bad old days, before we had digitized resources, we as scholars would regularly keep lists of interesting material that we felt was pertinent to our research or a particular topic. You still see vestiges of this even in the digital age and even outside of the academy. For example, on Amazon.com, you can create a list of books on a particular subject that you really like. On YouTube, you could create a playlist of videos like I have for this course. Those are, in essence, bibliographies of a sort. They're a list of works that have something in common that somebody might otherwise have a difficult time pulling all together. An annotated bibliography, when you get right down to it, is a list of texts. And those texts could be bound books, they could be articles. We'll go over that in another few minutes. The annotated bibliography has two parts, if you will. Each entry, let's say, has two individual parts. The first part lists important information about the text, the author, the publisher, and the date, just like what we've already looked like in a standard bibliography. And that part, I'll show you an example in a minute, that first portion of the annotated bibliography entry will usually be in the MLA or the Chicago Manual of Style format, depending on which of those formats you've chosen. The second part of an entry of an annotated bibliography contains that additional information that makes it different from a standard bibliography. This additional information is, as you might guess, the annotation, the process of adding notes of a summary information about the text and or an analysis of the text. Let me pause here for just a moment to point out that one of the other tasks for this learning module is to watch the introductory video for a piece of software that's a plugin for Mozilla, just like Nikai-chan is. It's called Zotero, Z-O-T-E-R-O. And Zotero is designed to help you compile bibliographies. It's shareware, it's relatively easy to use, and I would recommend it in the course of putting together your annotated bibliography, which is the final project for this course. You can buy other kinds of software that do similar things, but they tend to be kind of pricey. Now, I'll say just briefly, Zotero works really well with English language resources. It has a little bit of difficulty with Japanese. I wouldn't expect you to be using that many resources in Japanese, so I would still recommend using Zotero to help you compile your bibliography. Okay, so what are the types of annotations? This is important because when we get to the final project description, you'll see I require specific types of annotation. There are many types. The first is informative. An informative annotation summarizes your main findings or arguments from the source. So it describes objectively what the text says. A second type is evaluative. It evaluates the source. It assesses the source. It assesses its strengths and its weakness. This text is good because of this. This text is bad because of this, depending on what your research objectives are, that kind of thing. Another entry can be what we call indicative, which just describes what's included in the source. Those are relatively short, and I try to dissuade students from including more than one of those in their final project. And then, of course, you can combine these things. Some of your entry might be informative, and some of it then might be evaluative. And that seems to be the most common end product in producing an annotated bibliography. So let's look at an example of these different types of annotations, and I'm going to use a text with which you're familiar. In other words, the Daikon Wajiten. Morohashi. We just looked at Morohashi. So the top part of the entry is going to look like it would if it were in a bibliography. Notice I've got a hanging indent there, and I have the title in italics. Morohashi is the editor and not really the author, as it were, so I put his name later. And then I have the kanji in there, all that basic information that we would expect for an entry of this dictionary. Now here comes the annotation. Here's an informative annotation of Morohashi. Notice as we read through this that I'm not assessing the book. I'm not making a judgment call on it. I'm describing it. The single character entries include not only the standard forms of common and uncommon characters, but also Japanese kokuji and an extraordinary number of unusual and abbreviated forms. However slight the variation, the character will be given a separate entry with appropriate cross-references and will be included in the indices of Volume 13, which include a four-corner index plus a Japanese own index and a Kun index. The arrangement of the single characters is by radical and residual stroke count, and for each single character entry the following information is supplied: a cross-reference number, the flip-cut pronunciation, the rhyme, the Japanese pronunciation, the Chinese pronunciation and romanization, the small seal script, the definition of the character, etymological examples, relation to names, and any special usages of the character. Entries are often in both Japanese and classical Chinese. There's nothing in that description that anyone should disagree with. It is an objective description of the work. Okay, there's nothing that's evaluative, there's nothing that assesses it. Now let's look at an evaluative entry for the same book. The top part won't change. It will be the same regardless of whether you're writing an evaluative or an informative entry. Here's the evaluative entry. A comprehensive dictionary with over 40,000 Chinese characters, this work is an important reference text, if not maddening for many to use. That right there is an opinion. Entries contain much information, but are not always complete. Etymological references are usually to Chinese sources, so that a student of Japanese may have difficulty figuring them out. Indices are based on Japanese pronunciation, which makes them very difficult for a student of Chinese or Korean to work with. The use of the standard Kangxi radical system helps keep the work manageable for all CJK, Chinese, Japanese, Korean, students. You might argue a little bit with some of those statements. It's not ridiculously subjective, but certainly it's more subjective than what we saw in the informative entry. How about an indicative entry for the same work? Once again, the top part won't change. The description is usually pretty short in an indicative entry. Here we have an encyclopedic dictionary of Chinese characters compiled by a Japanese scholar, but with strong ties to sinology. Of course, I could write a lot more and still be indicative, but typically, once you get that verbose, you're back where we started, if you will, with the informative type of entry. Okay, so that's those are the nuts and bolts of the formatting and the approach that you can take in an annotated bibliography. Now I'd like to switch gears and look at types of sources, because as you'll see in the description of the final project, which we'll get to later, I ask for specific types of sources. One choice, of course, could be books, or monographs, or periodicals, book reviews, internet sources, and even reference materials. Let me go through each one of these individually and talk a little bit about the pros and cons of using them doing research, particularly in the humanities. Let's start with books, which used to be the most basic resource, but more and more I find students moving away from paper copies of books and moving toward digitized materials. Books generally provide in-depth and lengthy coverage on a given subject, but because of the amount of time involved to write and publish, particularly with academic presses, the information is not always up to the minute. Now, in the sciences, that would be a huge concern, because in the sciences, you might be researching a topic that requires the most current information available. But let's say you were researching Japanese history. Well, what happened 1,000 years ago happened 1,000 years ago. So if you're reading something about that period that was written 50 years ago, it's probably not going to be an issue. But you got to consider what your topic is. So for example, if you were writing a paper on Japanese geography, and you used a resource that was printed prior to 1945, when Japanese territory was much different than it is today, that would be a problem. So keep that in mind. If you're unsure about the merit of a book, what you can do is you can consult a book review published in a professional journal on the given subject area. We saw a lot of examples of that when we were looking at JSTOR and Project Muse, and that's the best place to find book reviews. I'll say a little bit more about reviews in another couple slides. So anyway, the point is, if you find a book in the library and you're really not sure whether it is worth citing, worth using, these are some of the litmus tests that you can use. How about monographs? In my experience, a lot of students don't even know what a monograph is. A monograph is a book on a very specific and very narrow topic. Usually they are published by special societies or academic presses. And they provide a wealth of detail about a particular topic by more deeply mining the available sources. Because the authors are not obligated to write only for a general audience, they're not worried about huge sales and that kind of thing, these books are a bit more challenging to read. Yet the reward is a much more sophisticated understanding of the relevant topic. And I've given an example here on the right-hand side of the slide of a monograph, something published in a monograph series quite a while ago, 1971, Forgeries and Imitations of the Dragon Stamps of Japan. That's pretty specific, but it's still an extended study of a particular topic. Periodicals. We've talked already about periodicals when we were learning about the databases JSTOR and Project Muse, and also the bibliography for Asian studies. But I want to revisit it just briefly. Periodicals are good sources for current information. Usually they come out twice a year, maybe 3 times a year, or 4 times a year. They differ from newspapers in that many periodicals are professional journals. They're scholarly journals devoted to a specific field of study, such as the examples that you see on your slide here. So when we talk about periodicals, at least at the university, we're not talking about necessarily, for example, the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or something like that. In the broader world, of course, those are considered periodicals. But when we talk about scholarly periodicals, we're looking at specific publications like Monumenta Nipponica or the Journal of Japanese Studies that are an academic cut above, and I'll say more about that in a couple minutes. These are really authoritative, these journals. That's why I said if you found something on JSTOR, if you found something on Project Muse, you don't really have to question whether it is a good resource. That work has already been done for you through peer review, about which I'll say more in a few minutes. Compared to books, periodicals tend to focus on a specific aspect of a topic. Typically, an article is 30 or maybe 40 pages long, and they're less useful for general overviews or histories of a topic. So once you get a general topic in mind and you start drilling down to a specific thesis question, that's when journal articles are going to come the most in handy. What about book reviews? Book reviews are good indicators of a work's value, as I was saying earlier, to a given subject area, especially if you're somewhat unfamiliar with a given field of study. Gee, I don't know very much about this particular field. I wonder if this author who published a book on it really knew what he was talking about. The way you can figure that out, of course, is to go to JSTOR or BAS or Project Muse and search for book reviews of that book. Book reviews usually make up half of any issue of an academic journal. They're much more meaty than you might expect. It's not like simply reading a once a week book review column in the local newspaper. Another really good source, and this is an online resource for scholarly reviews, is HNet, which is the Humanities and Social Sciences online network. It's all kinds of things, as we'll be seeing when we look a little more specifically at H Japan, which is a sub-page, if you will, of HNet. But this takes me to the internet, so I wanted to just say that the internet is a great resource for getting current information on a variety of topics. I'm not going to demonize it. I'm not going to say it's an awful thing. But as a professor, of course, you would expect me to say this, you should always consider the source. There is virtually no quality control on the internet. Everything that I've been talking about so far, the books, the journals, the book reviews, there's tremendous quality control behind all of those publications. But the internet is the Wild West. Anybody can post just about anything to it. There's some wonderful resources on the internet, but there's some really awful ones also. So as an example, let's take a look. HNet has two sublists. It has lots of sublists, but two of interest for us. One is called H Asia, which really ought to be called H China. And there's also one called H Japan with book reviews and scholarly discussions. Here's an example of their entry page, and you see that they have discussion logs. Sometimes scholars will write in and ask questions, some conundrum that they have in their research. They have lots of book reviews, and they're very quick about putting book reviews up. Sometimes in those academic journals, you end up reading a review of a book that was published 2 or 3 years ago. H Japan, because there's no hard copy of it, because it's all electronic, tends to be much faster. And it has some related links to other discussion groups within the HNet family. Here you can see recent messages, announcements, and things like that, and recent reviews. H Japan is something to which you can subscribe. I subscribe to it. And so I really keep my finger on the pulse of what's going on in Japanese studies by glancing through those posts on a regular basis. The last category of resource that I mentioned was reference materials. Admittedly, usually you wouldn't include reference materials in a bibliography, After all, it is expected that you use a dictionary and/or encyclopedia as a quick, ready reference kind of book, not as a main resource. But the nature of this course, which is Bibliographic Methods, calls for including reference materials in your final project. I'll require that you include at least one, such as Murahashi's dictionary or a bilingual dictionary or an encyclopedia. Any of those would be acceptable. So let me also talk about categories of sources. We talked just now about types of sources. But there is, in that great Venn diagram, some overlapping categories that you need to be familiar with. There's one distinction that's fundamental to all research, and that is between primary and secondary sources. So I wanted to clarify what we mean by those terms. These are technical terms, and if you don't know what they mean, you'll probably produce a weak paper. So let's start with primary sources. A primary source is an original document containing first-hand information. First-hand, that's the important word, about a topic. For example, in the case of history, primary sources are sources that were produced at the time of the event that you're studying, that you're researching. Although they are often the most important sources you use, this is not why we call them primary. They are primary because they are the first sources that address the question at hand. For example, if you are studying life in the imperial court during Japan's Heian period, Sei Shonagon's pillow book, which you see here on the right-hand side of your slide, would be a primary source. In that work, Sei Shonagon describes her life in the Heian court. What other types of primary sources are there? Different fields of study may use different types of primary sources, but common examples of a primary source in the humanities are diaries. And we were just mentioning Sei Shonagon's pillow book really is, in essence, a diary. Interviews. Let's say an interview was done with a historical figure. Letters that somebody exchanged. For example, letters that Sei Shonagon exchanged with other ladies in the imperial court. Photographs. Obviously, we don't have photographs from Heian, Japan, but photography has been around for quite a while now. And if you were, say, researching the Civil War and you had some photographs taken of the battlefields of the Civil War, those would be primary sources. And also works of literature written during a particular period. And that includes translations of literature. Even if the translation is done hundreds of years later, that is still considered a primary source. What about secondary sources? A secondary source contains commentary on or discussion about a primary source. The most important feature of secondary sources is that they offer an interpretation of information gathered from primary sources. Your own writing will fall into the second category and should, whenever possible, integrate primary and other secondary sources. One of the important skills that a student develops is the ability to decide which of the available primary and secondary sources are relevant. This, of course, presumes that the student is reading more widely than simply the material ultimately used in the work. And boy, I cannot emphasize this enough. One of the great tricks to the trade, if you will, about writing a really good research paper is being patient with these resources and recognizing that in order to write a really good, say, 10-page paper, you will need to read much more than 10 pages. Sometimes students feel like, I read it, therefore I have to include it. But actually, what you finally produce in your research paper is probably just the tip of the iceberg of the materials that you reviewed before you sat down and began writing. You have to accept that. Let's say you're doing your research and you come across a new idea that hadn't occurred to you, but it really doesn't fit into your current project. You're super excited about it. You can't let it go. And so you squeeze it in an awkward way into your paper, and it ends up being a bit of a mess. It happens to us all. It's a great idea. We don't want to leave it behind. But what you should do in that situation is write that idea down. Stash it somewhere you're not going to lose it, and then the next time you sit down to write a research paper, start with that. Okay. A few other things I want to say about secondary sources. The earliest secondary sources rely only on primary sources, but over time they layer. Over time, new secondary sources must take account of work that has already been done, and so they use both primary sources and other secondary sources. So as you see in this diagram on the right-hand side of the screen, we start with a primary source like the Pillow Book, and maybe an article written much later on the aesthetics of the Heian period, and then an article that uses both of those, the Pillow Book and the article on aesthetics, on the topic of marriage practices in the Heian period. Thus, an article on the Heian court, as I was saying, might refer to the Pillow Book as well as other articles and books on the Heian period. Common examples of a secondary source include the following: biographies. So I'm interested in, say, Shonagon, and I write a biography of her, or somebody, say, in the Muromachi period was interested in, say, Shonagon and wrote a biography on her. Dissertations, which are a lot like monographs. Indices, abstracts, and bibliographies, such as the Bibliography for Asian Studies and JSTOR and Project Muse. These are all secondary sources. Journal articles, such as from the Journal of Asian Studies or Monumenta Nipponica, and monographs, as we were just saying. So there's a world of material out there for you to use. But a few words of warning. Sometimes students, especially when they're beginning their research, they go to the library and they're trying to find information on a particular topic. And they go to the history, that say they're working on history, they go to the history section in the library and they see something like this, the history of the world in one volume. They're tempted to rely on the authority of these general textbooks as the basis for their historical writing. I gotta tell you, this is a huge mistake. Despite the prestige and visibility that comes with having authored a textbook, such authors are constrained by the nature of that kind of work and the fact that their audience is new to the subject from delving any deeper into any particular topic. They necessarily have to kind of skim along the surface. They can't be specific like what we see in monographs or scholarly articles. Instead, they have to present the most important events in the history they're surveying and give a general overview of the trajectory of the historical development. Thus, they will rarely present the kind of data and concrete analysis that will be necessary to support an analytical paper, such as what you're writing for a project that you do as an undergraduate. In the vast majority of cases, citing general surveys does little more than, frankly, demonstrate laziness or procrastination. What do I mean by that? Well, let's see. You put that paper off until the last minute. You don't have time to go to the library. It's 3 o'clock in the morning, library's closed, something like that. You look at your bookshelf. Oh, you've got History of Japan from that survey course that you took last semester. So you pull that off the shelf and you use that to try and support a very specific argument about a specific time in Japanese history. Not a good idea. So avoid those works that are called Modern China, Modern Japan, Modern Korea, that try, or the history of the world in one volume, that try and put all those things together. I don't want to say these are useless books, and certainly if you bought one for a survey course, it's not a bad thing to have. They have their place in the world. They do give that nice general overview of a topic, and they help put some of the events and the periods in context. So they do have a raison d'etre, if you will. Any academic writing requires that you carefully evaluate the quality of your sources. You've probably heard your professors say this before. It always bears repeating. The traditional academic publishing industry has developed practices that provide a lot of quality, some quality control, but a lot of quality control. And I'd like to digress a little bit in that direction to explain what I mean, to help clarify the issues surrounding your choice of sources. So keep the following in mind while you launch into your research, into writing your annotated bibliography, compiling your annotated bibliography. First of all, you should ask yourself about the author. Who is the author? Who published the work? Is the author a scholar? Okay. Is the author your Uncle Joe, who has a high school education but nothing much else? Who published the work? Was this published by an academic press? Was it published by a general press? These are important questions, as you'll see in the subsequent slides. An article published in the Journal of Asian Studies, for example, about the Communist Party in China carries a whole lot more weight than an article on the same subject published in Time or Newsweek. Now, you might think, hey, I like Time or Newsweek. I read it all the time. I know I have lots of friends that read it. I'm not trying to knock Time and Newsweek. They have their place in the world, but they are very different animals than a scholarly journal like the Journal of Asian Studies. The scope. You should ask yourself about the scope of your material. What is the coverage and how current is it? An article, for example, published in 1940 on Japanese government will say something entirely different, as I'm sure you can imagine, from one published in 1998. You should always check the date of your source and keep relevant East Asian history in mind. I have on occasion in my own experience received papers from students that read quite strangely. And as I read through it, I thought, gee, have I slipped into a time machine? What's going on here? And then when I look at the bibliography, I realized that the student used materials from the early 20th century to describe Japan today in the 21st century. And that usually is a big mistake. Let me say a little bit more about academic publishing, why Time and Newsweek are really not on the same level as something like the Journal of Asian Studies. The most important tradition in academic publishing, in other words, scholarly journals, university presses, so that includes books when I say university presses, is peer review. You've probably heard of peer review. You may even have heard a description of it, but I'd like to go over it again. Peer review starts on this diagram up in the upper left-hand corner with a researcher. And we often think of peer review as important in the sciences because they're recreating experiments, as I talked about earlier this semester, but peer review is important in all the disciplines. So let's say a researcher, not necessarily wearing a lab coat, writes a paper and submits it to the editor of a journal. So I'm writing a paper and I submit it to the editor of the Journal of Japanese Studies. Incidentally, when I do that, before I even submit it, you can bet I go to the Journal of Japanese Studies webpage and I check out their style guide and I make sure that I've followed all their rules, because there's nothing more irritating to an editor than getting something that breaks all the stylistic rules. They like consistency. So the editor then determines whether the article is of sufficient quality and appropriate content for the journal. If I submitted an article about China to the Journal of Japanese Studies, that would be inappropriate. And more often what happens is the editor will get back to the author and say, you know, this is about Japan, but it just doesn't, I don't think it's going to appeal to our audience. It's not where their interests lie. It's too specific, or occasionally you might even say it's too general. And so that that editor will either reject or accept it at that stage. If he accepts the article, that doesn't mean it's going to be published, at least not yet. Then he takes it and he passes it on to outside reviewers, usually 2 or 3 outside reviewers, not just one. Who are those people? Those are people who have specialized knowledge in the subject area and are oftentimes researchers themselves. So for example, as a professor in Japanese studies, I'm on occasion asked to review materials for scholarly presses. They send me the manuscript, I read through the whole thing, and I evaluate it. Likewise, in any case, these outside reviewers review the article for the quality of the research, and their goal is to find any gaps in the reasoning and to ensure that nothing has been overlooked, to make sure that it's a sound argument. And then they send their evaluations back to the editor. And then the editor has to make this decision again, the same decision. He has to decide whether to recommend to reject the article, toss it, or revise it, or accept it. So there's kind of three possibilities. When you hear back from the editor, when you're that researcher, the editor might write back and say, well, the outside reviewers said it's unpublishable. And that can be a real strike to your ego, but there it is. Sometimes the editor will say, more often than not, the editor will say, well, our reviewers think it's quite publishable, but they'd like to see these questions answered or these changes made. Will you please revise? And a third possibility, which almost never happens, is the editor writes back and says, the reviewers think this is the greatest article they've ever read in their lives, and we're just going to publish it as is. You don't have to touch it again. Frankly, I don't think I've ever met anybody who's had that happen to them. Certainly, I haven't. And let me just take a moment here, a break, to tell you that if you think the comments your professors make on your papers as an undergraduate are brutal, you should see the comments that these outside reviewers make. Usually they pull no punches, they're very careful readers, and it is a high stress aspect of being a professor, is getting that feedback. What happens next? Then the editor, let's assume that the article is publishable. The editor then contacts the researcher, and the researcher applies the reviewer's feedback and makes revisions as required, and then resubmits it to the editor. At that point, the editor looks at it and makes that final decision to publish or not, doesn't send it back out to reviewers. So the editor's now looked at it 3 times. And decides whether the concerns that the outside reviewers had were adequately addressed, and then if everything is okay, the article gets published. It is a long process, but you can see how once something's gone through that whole ringer, you can be pretty sure there aren't going to be huge errors in there. There's not going to be a horrible gaffe or an embarrassing mistake. This is why I say that if you get something from a scholarly journal, the outside reviewers have already done your work for you in terms of evaluating your resources. You don't have to worry about it. Somebody else who's super qualified has done it. Okay, back to other types of resources like commercial publishing time or Newsweek or New York Times or something like that. They don't always conform to the discipline imposed by the peer review process, nor are they obligated to. That's not a good thing or a bad thing. It's just a fact. The authors who publish in those venues are usually not academics. They're not professors. They are journalists. So that means that if you use a source published by a company like, say, Random House or Knopf or something like that, you might need to be more diligent in evaluating the quality of the source. You can't just say to yourself, well, it was published. Here I have this book in my hand. It must be worth something. You really have to carefully consider who the author is and what the venue is. All right, so that's paper stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the internet. As I was saying earlier, I love the internet. The internet is a great, great thing. It has changed my life as a researcher. The digitization of text has changed my life as a researcher. I would never want to go back. But the internet has introduced some new problems in the world of information literacy. By far the most important problem is that the internet, as I was saying, has no quality control. Some pages on the internet, individual pages, might have quality control, but the internet as a whole doesn't have quality control. There is, thank goodness, no big brother looking over the whole thing, at least not in the United States, and deciding what gets posted and what doesn't. So the amount of garbage that people have put online is staggering, but the amount of really good stuff that people put online is pretty staggering too. There are a few sites out there to help sort the jewels from the junk, but really you're essentially on your own when you're using the web, and so this puts a great deal of responsibility on you. That responsibility for assessing your resources that you don't have to worry about when you're using scholarly journals. There are lots of web pages that address this. I'm going to give you just a couple pointers about evaluating your sources when you're using internet materials. First of all, you should look at the site of the web page, in other words, the URL of the web page. The URL is that thing that begins with HTTP. And what can you look for in that web page? Well, you might ask yourself, is this a web page hosted by an academic institution? And if the answer is yes, and you can tell because it ends in .edu, at least in the United States, then that's usually a pretty good sign. But you still have to be careful. Why do I say that? Because often, for example, your peers, other undergraduate at other schools, will be posting their work on the internet. Maybe their professor wants them to do it that way, submit that way, what have you. Maybe they're just proud of the paper that they wrote. Just because something appears on an edu URL doesn't mean that it was written by an expert in the field. Another problem you might have is that you might stumble upon materials that somebody, let's say a professor of physics, published in an entirely different area, a hobby that he has, something like aviation. Okay, and so just the edu ending doesn't guarantee that it's going to be something good. A commercial domain, .com, is less reliable than an educational domain. Gov tends to be pretty good as an ending, as an extension. Gov, of course, it means government documents. Non-for-profit domains like org are a mixed bag. In East Asian URLs, there are differences, however, that you should be aware of. So a commercial domain, for example, in Japan, is .co, not .com. The educational domain is not .edu, it's .ac. And the government domain is .go, not .gov. Non-for-profit is .or. So when you're working with Japanese language resources, Japanese language internet pages, you have to keep that in mind. Okay, so delving further down into those web pages, you should look at the author's credentials if they're posted. If not, you can always Google the person, I suppose, and try and find out some more information about the author. You should ask yourself, does the article have an acknowledged author? If not, be suspicious. Is it one of those many, many, many web pages out there where you can't really tell who posted it? There's no name on it, there's no indication. Even when you go in and you look at the source code, you can't figure out who wrote it. If nobody wants to take credit for it, that's probably not a good sign. If there is somebody there who's put their name to the web page, ask what are his or her credentials. Be careful about that, though. The author might say he's got a PhD, but as I was mentioning earlier, you got to make sure if he's writing on Chinese history that his PhD is not in something else like, say, mechanical engineering, unless maybe he's writing on Chinese mechanical engineering. Just because you have a degree of some sort doesn't mean that you're an expert in a particular topic, because the degree and the topic might be in two very different realms. You should also ask if the author is a faculty member at an accredited college or university. Not to be too snobby about it, but there is a big difference between an accredited college or university and a school that is not accredited. Schools that are not accredited usually aren't for a reason, because the quality of their academics and the quality of their faculty don't meet a certain industry standard. And you should also ask, if you're looking at a scholarly resource, does that author have a degree from such an institution? In other words, from an institution that's accredited, or from a college or university that's accredited. Just because somebody has a PhD doesn't mean that they were doing the same quality of work as a graduate student as the next guy. You should also check the date of the article. Is it recent, or did someone simply enter something from the 19th century? Did they cut and paste some material from a long time ago? You might also ask if the site is regularly updated. Often websites will have a space at the bottom that tells you when it was last updated. For example, our East Asian Studies Department website here at the University of Albany has one of those on our main index page. Every time I update a page there, then that date changes. And so you can see that the information is relatively new and fresh. It hasn't just been sitting there for 3 or 4 years. And then you kind of have to delve in, read that article, read that web page critically in the light of your other sources. If all of your other sources contradict the work, check its citation notes to evaluate its evidence. And if it doesn't have citation notes, that should be a real red flag for you right there. Every good scholar should have that citation so that you, the reader, can recreate the experiment. I'm the mother of a middle schooler and a high schooler, and I'm constantly debating with them because they'll come home from school and they'll say, "Mom, did you know that such and such?" And I'll say, "Oh, really? Where'd you learn that?" "Well, I saw it on the internet." And they hear the refrain over and over again. Just because you saw it on the internet doesn't make it so. With me, I'm more demanding. Sometimes they'll say, "I read it in a book," and I say, "Yeah, well, who is the authority of that book? Did you look to see who wrote the book? Did you look at the bibliography?" And they roll their eyes in their head. But these are important questions. Evaluating your sources is important because your final product, whether it's an annotated bibliography, a research paper, or a combination of the two, will only be as good as the sources that you're working with.